Okay, well, good morning. Thank you, and I want to welcome you to this rather brief discussion about the Millennial Initiative here in the Senate. I asked the Millennial Senators to gather and work together to identify the priority issues among millennials here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I asked Senator Lesser if he would chair on the part of the Senate, and Senator Tarr asked Senator Ryan Fatman to chair on the part of the minority, and then Patrick O'Connor here is another of the millennials in the Republican caucus, and Senator Joe Boncore for the Democrats as well. So they organized a series of events across the Commonwealth over roughly a year's period, and engaged with millennials to identify priority concerns and issues. The reason I asked that this initiative be organized is because we have, for two reasons. The first is there are now more millennials than there are baby boomers. And so the world is changing. And as I look at the public policy work here in the state government, I still see it emphasizing people with families and older folk, and I saw a whole range of issues that millennials were facing that I was aware of, from college debt to affordable housing and things of that nature, and I thought if we don't have a conversation with them, we're not going to really be able to drill down and understand what their interests and concerns are, and therefore we won't have an agenda that we can push forward. The second reason, frankly, was political, because I know a lot of young people are so busy with their education and starting their careers and their families that politics is not on the front burner for them. But given the nature of the world we're living in and the kinds of challenges we're facing, the millennials have a big job ahead of them as adults and moving into the community and into leadership positions, because there are quite a few problems that are going to carry through over really decades into the future, from climate change to income inequality and other problems that the millennial generation has to be part of solving, because they are living and working and raising families among us, and they're going to be having to carry on to address these problems well beyond the boomers and even the Gen, I guess we call them Gen X's or Gen Y.
For the youngest ones?
No, the parents of
Gen X.
Gen Xers, then the Gen Xers. So that's basically was my motivation. It was policy driven, but with an eye toward the fact that we need these young people involved in making the decisions that are going to affect their lives for decades to come. And so with that, I will turn it over to the millennial senators to offer their comments and backgrounds, and I'm just going to switch seats so that I get out of the center of the picture and on the edge where this boomer belongs.
Well, thank you. Here. Thank you, Mr. President. And so just the background on how this all got started, Senator Fatman from the Republican caucus and myself at the instruction and invitation of the Senate President and of Leader Tarr really wanted to embrace and think through how state government can become more responsive and better attached to what is now the largest and most diverse generation in American history. And we know the statistics and the public commentary about millennials. So what we thought was, instead of telling millennials what we're working on or what we want to work on, let's go out and actually ask and have a two-sided conversation about what we want accomplished together. So we did a set of 11 roundtables and engagements across the state. There's a map in the report that gives all the locations, and we worked very hard over an almost year period to engage with as many different types of millennials as possible. The hoodie wearing, iPhone focused sort of tech millennial is what gets talked about the most in popular culture, but is really only one part of what is a very, very big, very, very diverse generation. So we did events in rural areas. We hosted an event in Greenfield. The Senate President did one there. Senator Fatman hosted an event in Paxton. Senator Goby hosted events in her district. We did one in Lawrence in Spanish with an interpreter that we brought with us. We spoke to young adults in Boston, in Holyoke, in Springfield. We did a student-focused one in the 5 College area in Amherst. So we worked to include every geography and as many different constituencies as possible in the state. And we really came away with 2 kind of big takeaways. One is the sense of alienation and frustration with the political system is real. And we need to embrace that and recognize that as leaders and be responsive to it. And while there is a deep and pervasive sense of alienation and frustration with the political system, it would be a mistake to assume that that means that millennials are apathetic or disengaged, because we saw 2 things kind of happening simultaneously, a sense of frustration and alienation, like I said, from traditional political and government systems, but at the same time a very earnest desire to be involved and to be engaged in issues. And this came across both anecdotally in our roundtables, and also the data shows this. When you look at reports that have been done by Harvard or by Tufts and the Circle Initiative there or other universities, they show this, that it's a generation that's ambitious about solving problems but doesn't necessarily view the traditional political system as the best way to solve those problems. So as we went through, we really found kind of 6 specific issue areas that kept coming up again and again at the roundtables. And the good thing is the way we put this report together, and I'll have Senator Boncory and Senator O'Connor talk about their items as well in a moment, but what we tried to do was, as much as possible, bring the top line issue that was presented at the roundtable and then match it to bills that are already pending in the legislature, in particular in the Senate, that are directly touch upon the item discussed. So for example, in innovation and transparency, we identify things like a Massachusetts open data standard, which is a bill that was filed this session by myself to systematize and regularize data collection across state agencies and local governments. Things like a We the People initiative to better connect citizen engagement with what's happening in the legislature. So we went through this on a variety of issues. Probably the largest section was really around innovation and transparency and modernization of government. That came up again and again. We also heard a lot about student debt. That, of course, has been talked about a lot. Student debt, though, it was actually broader than just student debt. It was financial insecurity and debt across the board. We heard a lot of stories from people about balancing credit card payments, balancing student loan payments, balancing high housing costs, balancing high transportation costs, and sort of making sense of all of that. We heard a lot about transportation. That certainly comes as no surprise. The feedback and the commentary from millennials on transportation differed a little bit by geography. Folks on the South Coast, we did a session in Fall River, and in Western Massachusetts, talked a lot about a feeling of dislocation and distance from the job centers and the employment opportunities that some of their peers had in Boston. Folks in Boston talked quite a lot about reliability of public transit, improvements to public transit, and an increasing lack of interest, frankly, in owning cars, which was kind of interesting and came up in the roundtable. So a big emphasis on things like ride sharing, autonomous vehicles, improvements to new innovations around transportation. We also heard a lot about what we kind of describe in the report as civics, financial, and media literacy. We heard a lot of commentary from young people about, I want to get involved, I care about this issue, but I don't really know how, or it all seems like a lot of noise, or it all seems very confusing. And so we have some specific recommendations in there about beefing up school curriculums and strengthening school curriculums around civics, around media literacy. We heard a lot of commentary and a lot of comments in the roundtables, things like, I don't know who to believe, I don't know what's true, I don't know what's fake news, I don't know what's not. These are, of course, all important issues anyone in politics deals with, but training and teaching students to really understand sources, understand how to critically read news and material will be important to get into school curriculums. And then final two, real quick, before I turn it over to my colleagues, veterans. This is often an overlooked segment of the millennial population. We did a roundtable with Senator Humison in Westfield, just outside of Barnes Air Force Base, where the 104th Fighter Wing is based. And we met with a group of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are currently enrolled in a program at Westfield State College around re-entry of veterans into the civilian workforce. And we heard some very intense stories from them about transitioning back to civilian life. There was one gentleman that we spoke with who was a military police officer overseas for the military. He wanted to come home and be a civilian police officer, and he had to redo all of the training that he had already gone through in the military to be able to qualify for the civilian credentialing. Now, obviously, there's a difference between being a military police officer and being a civilian police officer, so we're not saying that you shouldn't have training specific to civilian policing, but the stories he was telling seemed highly redundant and a little bit cumbersome, and definitely I think something we could do better on in terms of helping young people transition back into the workforce. And then we heard a lot about housing, and Senator Sear drafted large sections of this part of the report. This really was often very geographic dependent. At our Quincy roundtable that Senator Keenan hosted, we heard a lot about costs of housing, certainly on Cape Cod, and in the greater metro Boston area, places like Senator Boncory and Senator O'Connor's districts. This is a very, very big issue. So we include recommendations around things like better use of cluster developments, denser housing, millennial villages. A lot of that is local regulation, but there's work we can do on a state level. For example, the zoning reform the Senate took up last session to better incentivize that denser, more transit-oriented housing stock that millennials and young people really emphasize. Again, it's connected to transportation and less of a dependence on car ownership. So the takeaway was a couple of things. Number one, it's an engaged generation that is looking to make its mark, but doesn't necessarily at this point view politics and government as the way to do that. So I think we have an obligation to step up and show them that government can and will be responsive to this generation's needs. And so we're recommending at the end of the report, number one, that a Millennial Caucus be established, which is already sort of underway. We all certainly meet informally, but we have a recommendation to kind of more formalize that process the way you have other caucuses in the legislature. And then the second thing is to create some type of millennial scorecard. Now, this report was bipartisan. We had all the millennial members of the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, have signed on to it and are participating in it. The takeaway was less about one ideology or another, or one point of view or another, and more about a style and a process of approaching problems that's results oriented and that emphasizes engagement. And so some type of metric for establishing our success at doing that in this session and in future sessions, I believe, will be important. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues if they have anything that they want to chime in on.
Sure. I just want to thank Senate President for putting this initiative together. I want to thank Senator Lesser and Senator Fatmans for their leadership on these issues. As we engaged, and as the report will show, millennials of this generation are ready to take up the mantle. As they circumvented the Commonwealth on their tour, they learned that this is a generation that wants to get involved and wants to decide on policy, and they realize that our parents' problems are not our problems. That generation had different problems around housing affordability, around transportation infrastructure that might add is now crumbling around us. And although we have those problems, they need to be looked at through a different lens. When we talk about housing, we need to talk about affordable housing in areas, and we need to consider that people of our generation have crushing student debt that our parents never had. When we talk about housing in and around the metro Boston area, it's a price disproportion. It's completely unaffordable. Millennials, who are coming out of college and graduate school, they can't stay here. And they can't move out west and live out west where housing is less affordable because the transportation infrastructure simply doesn't exist. So, I mean, I think it's important that when we think about millennials staying here and retaining the educated workforce and graduates that Massachusetts has from its great institutions of higher education, we have to talk about some of the issues surrounding zoning. We need to shed light on the fact that, in the past 10 years, only 5 cities and towns in the Commonwealth have developed more than half of the multifamily housing in the Commonwealth. I mean, we need everyone to take part in this. The cost of housing is just far too expensive in and around this area. So we need to grow our transportation infrastructure. So we're two interrelated. And while parents' problems aren't our problems, our parents' solutions aren't our solutions either. As we move towards an automated technology, as we move towards cars that drive themselves, when we're talking about funding for transportation infrastructure, we can't be thinking about the gas tax. And we did miss a big opportunity on the gas tax and plenty of revenue that could be invested in infrastructure now. But as we move forward, it's our generational responsibility, I think, to think about the next generation. Previous generations have saddled this legislator and this body of policymakers with a crumbling infrastructure, the MBTAs and a $7.5 billion state of good repair deficit. Our state highways are in a $5 billion state of good repair deficit. That means for the MBTA, we need $7.5 billion to get that system up to reliable and running. And that's before we can think about expansion of rail or expansion of transportation infrastructure. So I think we have our heads on straight. We're looking forward, and we're going to ensure that the next generation, isn't dealing with that on a retroactive basis. We're going to try to be proactive. So in 10, 20 years, when we're not here, the next generation of policymakers has an ear and an idea, and some of the, new taxes that we're thinking about, away from the gas tax, but the fair share tax amendment obviously is something at the forefront, and maybe moving to a system where we're taxing services instead of gas, with the mind to automated vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and electric vehicles. I think it's important that we're having this discussion with millennials across the Commonwealth. We want to let millennials know that this report isn't the end of the engagement, but it's really the beginning of the engagement. So I'll pass it off to Senator O'Connor.
Sure, it's an honor to be here and be a Republican, to join in a bipartisan fashion. Senator Fatman sends his regrets that he couldn't be here today as one of the co-chairs of the initiative. I think that a lot of what faces millennials has been discussed by Senator Moncori, Senator Lesser, and Senate President Rosenberg. But when you look at the fact that we have students that are graduating our institutions with a mortgage of debt, and then they go out into a housing market that's completely unaffordable, there's something wrong there, and there's something that has to be done. And hopefully with these initiatives that we're trying to undertake, we can address some of those. But also, when Senator Lesser talked about the fact that millennials aren't as engaged in the political process, we need to make sure that they are, because the work that's being done here in the Massachusetts State Senate is important. And the work that's been done by our predecessors in the Senate has been important, as far as focusing on making sure we protect our veterans, making sure we protect those with developmental disabilities, making sure we assist our seniors as much as we can, and make sure we continue to progress in all of the issues that we care about so much. Because I truly believe that Massachusetts is the model for the entire nation to look at once, hopefully, the dysfunction sets aside. And I think that is one of the most important things, is that we continue to engage, we continue to get people involved and see the real good work that's being done here in Massachusetts, incomparable to elsewhere in the country. And in addition to that, one thing that wasn't hit on was the opiate crisis that we have right now in Massachusetts. In my hometown of Weymouth alone, we had 38 deaths last year, with the average age being a millennial. Something needs to be done about this, and I know that we are doing as much as we possibly can, but it seems that every step that we take forward, we get hit with fentanyl. Once we finally addressed some of the real problems with heroin, we are addressed with fentanyl and then carfentanil. It's one of those things that this is a lot of the issues of our time when it comes to the heroin epidemic, when it comes to the housing crisis, when it comes to the lack of affordability in college. We need to address these issues. We need to address them head on, and I truly believe that this Millennial Engagement Initiative is really the first step that this caucus will take to address these issues. And I think that all of it combined is going to, in a bipartisan fashion that's been shepherded by the Senate President and shepherded by Minority Leader Tarr, is going to really make Massachusetts an even better place to live, to work, to raise a family. So I'm proud to be part of this.
Thank you, Pat. Also proud to be part of this. I want to first and foremost really thank the Senate President and the Minority Leader. There have been folks in their 20s and 30s who've been elected to this body and to this legislature for decades, hundreds of years. But here in the Senate, sort of the typical leadership structure would mean that the gentleman that I'm serving with we would spend a lot of time very much in the back rows of the Senate, not having as full of a voice, and that has really fundamentally changed under the Senate President's shared leadership, shared responsibility model. I think that makes a really big difference. And I think that if you look at, as someone who's now is going into my 11th month in this body, I'm just amazed at the input that, not only I as a senator, but especially as a millennial, and I'm the youngest member of the body. Sorry, Eric. I nudged him out. I think that that's really noteworthy and really important. I think as Senator O'Connor said, we are losing a generation to the opiate epidemic, and there's a lot of conversation about this more broadly in the building. I think we need to be looking at more carefully who in the millennial generation is really being affected by this. So I look at the region I represent on Cape Cod, and we actually did a look at death data from 2004 to 2014, and 69% of the deaths, hundreds of deaths, and most of these folks are millennials. 69% of these folks are folks with a high school education or less. They're straight to work, and 1 in 4 were involved in construction, right? So I think we've got to do a better job as a Commonwealth looking at the needs of this millennial population. I think when it comes to housing, the region that I represent, we've become just profoundly unaffordable. We have a very much out of whack real estate market where you have a second home market. It's a little unique, but I think that we've done a poor job building for our needs. We need to talk seriously about housing production. We need to be confronting the sort of pernicious aspect of NIMBYism, which frankly is really enabled by the form of very local direct government that we have, and sort of God bless our small town governments and our town meetings, but this makes it really hard to do long-term policy making and planning that's going to meet the needs of our community. I also think it's really important that we have a vibrant, strong millennial generation, because we're going to need millennials to take care of our parents' generation. And our parents' generation, in all honesty, is not necessarily in the best shape when looking at their retirement and looking at taking care of this generation into the future. And I think you're going to need the commitment, the innovation, the creativity, and the investment of millennials to do that. And if we're not living here in the state or living in these communities, that's another challenge. And then finally, I would just say, I think the bipartisan or the consensus quality of millennials, I think, is something that's really really unique and important. And if you look at statewide polling, if you look at national polling on this as well, there really is a consensus among millennials around our shared values, around a willingness to really get things done. I think to move past the pretty acidic environment that we have, at least on the national level. I feel really privileged to be part of this bipartisan effort, but I think that's something that, despite our current national politics, that's something that really gives me hope in wanting to see more millennials involved. I think we still have work to do. If you look at who the millennials are in the Senate, we do happen to all be men. I don't know if that is a coincidence or if that's sort of reflective of structural challenges within our communities and within our politics. Probably a little of both, but that's just another piece that I wanted to hold up.